In the spirit of reconciliation, we acknowledge the traditional custodians of this land, the First Nations people who have walked and cared for this land for thousands of years. We acknowledge their descendants who maintain their spiritual connection with this land and the traditions passed down from generation to generation. We thank them for sharing their cultures, spirituality, and ways of living with the land in this place we all now call home. We pay respect to elders past, present, and emerging. May we continue to walk gently and respectfully together with each other. My name is Tenzin Chodron. I'm a Buddhist nun in the Tibetan tradition, and I work with Karuna Hospice Service. I'm going to do an introductory talk about Buddhism on behalf of the Queensland Faith Communities Council. Buddhism began about 2,500 years ago in India, where the Buddha was born. He spoke and taught for many years and brought forth what were called scriptures or sutras, about 84,000 different teachings which have been written down through oral tradition and now written down, used by various Buddhist traditions. So Buddhism spread to different countries after it left India, into Southeast Asia, into Thailand, Burma, Vietnam, China, to Tibet, to Mongolia, to Bhutan, to many countries, to Korea, and to Japan. And in more recent years, Buddhism has moved into the West, where it's become much more popular in recent years. We have a relatively small population of Buddhists in Australia, but it's a growing religion. And many people are drawn to ideas of Buddhism without necessarily taking on the Buddhist faith. In this tradition, there are both lay practitioners, those who are not ordained, and there are ordained practitioners, nuns and monks, and in the Zen Buddhist tradition, Zen priests. So as Buddhism has developed and moved into different countries, it's taken on some different cultural characteristics, but basically all Buddhist traditions are connected with the same four fundamental noble truths that the Buddha taught at the beginning of his teachings, what are called the truth of suffering, the truth of the origin of suffering, the truth of the cessation or ending of suffering, and the truth of path to that ending of suffering. So it's a bit like a tree with roots. All of us relate to the same fundamental roots of these teachings, and there are different branches of Buddhism as it spread throughout the world. One of the main things in the Buddhist tradition is an understanding that all of us, every single being, wants to have happiness and doesn't want to have suffering. This is a basic thing for all of us. And the teachings focus on the ability that all of us have to bring about happiness in our lives through various measures and to overcome suffering in our lives. We're all familiar with many types of suffering, with physical suffering, with emotional and mental suffering. And in Buddhism, we talk about suffering at even deeper levels than that. We talk about also what's called the suffering of change, the fact that what we normally hold on to as happiness changes from moment to moment, that we can't grasp it and hold on to it forever. It will always change. We also have a more fundamental type of suffering, which means that all of us are born, we live, and we die without being able to control this process. And that's connected with the teaching on what's called the law of cause and effect, or you may have heard of the word karma. Basically, karma means action, that any action is a cause that produces a result. So if the action is positive, it will necessarily produce a positive result of some type of happiness or well-being. If the action is negative, it will necessarily produce some sort of negative result, some type of suffering or lack of well-being. And so this idea of the law of cause and effect, or karma, is taught through these Buddhist scriptures or sutras, meaning that we take responsibility for our own lives. And in understanding our experience of life and death, we also understand this working of the law of cause and effect, or karma. So in terms of being with someone in a hospital situation, someone who's sick or even someone who's dying, if it's a Buddhist patient, then like with other traditions, other religions, the basic fundamental thing is to have a sense of respect and sensitivity to their needs. Really to ask them what they need, to check with them what's most appropriate for them individually and for their family. In a general sense, for Buddhists, some Buddhists are strict vegetarians. Other Buddhists, like in the Tibetan tradition, also eat meat because in Tibet, the Himalayas are so high that nothing much grows up there. They have yak meat and potatoes and a few vegetables, but they're not able to maintain a vegetarian diet. And so for the Tibetan community, they are meat eaters. And so it's best to be able to check with the family, with the person, what is beneficial for them in terms of their diet. And also in terms of spiritual practice. I think like in the Christian tradition and other traditions, in the Buddhist tradition there are some people who have grown up in a Buddhist family and they're more like cultural Buddhists. So they may not have a deep practice in their own life. They may observe some Buddhist rituals, but they may not be deep meditators. They may not use prayer and meditation in the same way. In the same way with Christianity, some people may go to Mass at Christmas and Easter, but may not practice deeply through the rest of the year. Then there are other Buddhists who integrate their beliefs and their practices very deeply, and they use meditation and prayer on a daily basis. For those Buddhists, then it's also important to be able to check with them about their own needs. When someone is dying, there's a process that happens as the body is gradually shutting down, as the organs of the body and the systems of the body are slowly shutting down and coming to a stop. There's a withdrawal of energy that happens with that gradually over time. If it's not a sudden death, if it's a progressive death, for example with cancer or other illnesses such as that. So during that time, the energy of the person and what we call their consciousness withdraws gradually as the body is shutting down to a point where when their breathing and their heart is stopped, and medically we would say this person has died. From the Buddhist point of view, that's not the actual time of death. There's still a gradual withdrawal of very subtle energy and very subtle consciousness to a more subtle level before it leaves the body. In the Christian tradition, we may refer to this as the soul leaving the body. In the Buddhist tradition, we'd call it the subtle or very subtle consciousness. And that takes time before it leaves the body. So for Buddhist families, it's usually important to allow the person to stay undisturbed after their breathing has stopped, after their heart has stopped, and medically we'd say this person has died. It's important to allow them to lie undisturbed even for a few hours, whatever is okay in terms of the hospital policy, but to allow that family to be there to do prayers and meditation while that very subtle process is continuing before the consciousness leaves the body. So in the Buddhist tradition, one of the indications that the consciousness has not left the body is the body hasn't started to smell yet. When a smell arises, that's an indication that the body has gone, that the subtle consciousness has gone. So during that time, in the time as the consciousness and the subtle energy are withdrawing, as the person is actively dying, it's very important to have a very peaceful environment for the environment, the inner environment of the person to be very peaceful, and to help to create that, to have a very peaceful external environment. And that includes the people who are around the person. So the family, the carers, and even the doctors and nurses coming in, to come in a very sensitive and respectful way, to recognise the process that's going on, and to see it as a sacred process. So for a Buddhist, it's a very sacred time as the dying process is going on. Because many of you will be aware, in the Buddhist tradition, there's a belief that there's a continuation after death. And there's even a belief that we've been here before and that we'll come back again. So a belief in past and future lives. So one of the important things in the time of death is a person's state of mind. We don't want the person to be agitated. We don't want them to be fearful or angry or grasping and clinging. We want to create a very peaceful environment, a very peaceful state of mind, to help them create a peaceful state of mind so they can go through that dying process in a very gentle and peaceful way. The reason behind that is that they say that the state of mind at the time of death awakens or ripens a karmic seed, which then influences the ongoing journey and influences the next rebirth. If the karmic seed is a positive one, that means from the Buddhist point of view, that ongoing journey and even that next rebirth will be positive. If the karmic seed that's ripened at the time of death is what's called a negative one, it could make the ongoing journey more difficult for the person and even have a difficult rebirth. So in the Buddhist tradition, there's a lot of preparation for the time of death. There's a lot of preparation for the actual process of dying, not in a morbid sense, but with the recognition that all of us could die at any time. We don't know when we're going to die. We don't know how we're going to die. We don't know if it's going to happen suddenly or over a long period of time. We don't know if we're going to have a long-term disease or a sudden heart attack, car accident, or some other sort of death that happens very quickly. So in the Buddhist tradition, there's an emphasis on training our mind to be prepared for death at any time, so that when death arises, when it happens, we can have a positive state of mind. We can remember this practice to die with particularly not only a peaceful state of mind, if possible, but even more, a better state of mind to die with is one of compassion or one of loving kindness for others. And compassion, loving kindness, wisdom, all of those higher qualities are very emphasized in the Buddhist tradition. We train to develop those. We train in meditation, we train in different practices to develop compassion and wisdom and to be able to generate them as deeply as possible for the benefit of others, and also at the time of death, at the time of dying. So there's a lot of emphasis on that practice. And for a Buddhist person in hospital, a Buddhist person who's sick or who's dying, then they may have particular prayers or practices that they do each day. And it's very helpful if they can have a quiet atmosphere to do that in. It's not always possible in a hospital situation. And of course, it's not always possible when we're dying. We may be surrounded by sirens when that happens. We may be in a car accident and there may be a lot of noise around us. If we've trained our mind to be able to move into a state of stillness and quiet compassion and kindness at that time, and that takes a lot of training, but if we can do that, we can make that dying process and that ongoing journey much more peaceful and beneficial. In talking about all of this, in talking about preparing for death, consciousness, illness, how we train our mind, one of the questions that can sometimes arise is, what about the effect of medication on someone who's dying or someone who's ill, but particularly at the time of death? What does medication do to the mind and to this process? So basically, we need to be, in order to be able to work with the mind as clearly as possible, it's best to be pain-free. So to be able to find that balance with medication where we've still got some conscious awareness, but the body is not in pain. Because you know what it's like when we're in pain. If we've got a toothache or a headache or any type of pain, the mind goes to that pain and we become focused on the pain rather than focused on meditation or stilling or the mind or mindfulness. So with medication, we want to be able to find whatever balance is right for that person to keep them pain-free, and as much as possible to be able to be as conscious as possible during that time of dying. Sometimes that's not possible. Sometimes people are in very extreme pain. So it's up to the nurses and the doctors to be able to tweak the medication as best as possible. For a practicing Buddhist who's using meditation in a significant way in their life, then they're wanting to use less medication so that they're able to stay as awake and aware during the dying process as possible. Because from the Buddhist tradition there's a belief that there's a great opportunity as we're dying, because we move to this extraordinary state of purity, our Buddha nature, as we're dying. For those who are practicing Buddhists, they want to be able to use meditation during that time. So again, it's up to the individual, how much pain relief they need, what's going to work for them, and how much they're able to work with what's going on with their body and their own meditation practice. Again, there's no absolute black and white answer to any question, and there are always different aspects that we have to take into consideration, but for the most part, it would be very unlikely that a Buddhist would use euthanasia or assist anyone else with that, because of this sense of the respect for human life. And the reason behind that is that it's said that we can be reborn in different types of realms, but the human realm is one where we can practice the spiritual path, meaning that we can move towards freeing ourselves from suffering and moving towards attaining complete happiness or enlightenment. So to take away the life or to end that life prematurely isn't seen as a positive thing from the Buddhist point of view. At the same time, we want to be able to allow someone to go through the dying process with dignity, with sensitivity, with pain relief, with as much comfort as possible and as much care and compassion as possible, so that we are with them with compassionate presence. So whatever they need, we're attending to their needs, and at the same time allowing them to go through the dying process in their own time, rather than bringing about that at an earlier time. Another belief connected with that is that it's connected with the belief in the law of cause and effect, the law of karma, that we're living out a particular karma through an illness and through our death, and to stop that, even with the thought of I want to do this to take away the suffering of someone. So one thing that the Dalai Lama has said is, if we had clairvoyance and we knew what was going to happen for that person after they died, and we could see where they were going to go, and that they would be definitely free of suffering, then maybe we could use euthanasia if we had that ability to see. If we don't have that ability to see, we don't know if that suffering is going to continue for them without the help of us around them and without the help of pain relief. So it's not a black and white question, but we approach it with as much deep compassion as possible. From the Buddhist point of view, blood transfusions are fine, whatever's needed to be able to support the person, to be able to get well, or if they're very ill, whatever is needed in that sense is fine. With organ donations, there's a couple of different ways of approaching it. If someone is a very serious practitioner of Buddhism, if they're a serious meditator, someone who meditates deeply every day and has trained their mind in meditation over a number of years, then it's better for them, particularly as they're going through the dying stage and immediately after death, for their body not to be disturbed, because they're wanting to die in a meditative state. If they're not a deep practitioner and a very serious meditator, then to be able to do organ donation can be a great act of compassion. So if you make the decision, I'd like to offer my organs to others, then that's a great act of generosity and compassion and loving kindness before you die. And so both ways are seen as positive. If you want to be able to stay very focused on meditation as you're dying, then you wouldn't agree to organ donation, because you're wanting to keep the body and mind as still and undisturbed as possible. If that's not a practice that you've been doing for years and years, then organ donation is seen as a beautiful act of generosity and compassion. So both ways are seen as positive in different lights. In the Buddhist tradition, there are many rituals that we have, different practices. In the different Buddhist traditions themselves, there are some variations in the prayers and the practices that we do. Again, they're related to the same fundamental beliefs, but there are some variations. So, for example, I remember talking with a Buddhist nun in the Chinese tradition, and she said that when someone dies in the Chinese tradition, that Buddhist monks and nuns will go into the hospital room after the death has happened, and they chant for up to 7 hours a beautiful chant called the chant to Amitabha Buddha. And that's a belief that the person's consciousness will go to what's called a pure land, the pure land of Amitabha. And that's in the Chinese Buddhist tradition. And she said the energy that's created in the room with this chanting is just extraordinary and incredibly peaceful. So again, there needs to be, if possible, a sense of respect and sensitivity for the cultural beliefs and spiritual beliefs of any Buddhist. In the Tibetan tradition, we also have particular prayers and practices that we do when someone is sick and also at the time of death. And so it may be that a monk or nun will go in either as someone is actively dying in those last hours or last couple of days and do the particular prayers. Sometimes there are blessed substances placed on the crown of the head or on the heart center in the middle of the chest, and there are particular mantras that are recited, particularly in the Tibetan tradition, mantras of compassion, of wisdom, mantras of purification for the person so that their ongoing journey is positive. So there are many prayers and practices that are done either just as someone is dying, but these can also be done after their breathing and heart have stopped. And again, there's a belief that the consciousness is still within the body, and the practices can be done after the person has technically, in a medical sense, died. And even for the next 7, 14, 21, up to 49 days, there are particular prayers that are done for the consciousness or the person after they've died. Because there's a belief that the rebirth will occur within 49 days. And also it's important, I often say this to families of loved ones who have died, because their connection with the person is so strong, from the Buddhist point of view, because their karmic connection is so strong, and from their point of view, because they love them so much, any practice that they do that is dedicated for their loved one has a very positive effect. So, for example, if they do an act of generosity, say they want to give $25 to the Red Cross, and it's an act of generosity, if they dedicate that to their loved one, from the Buddhist point of view, because their connection is so strong, that has an effect, a positive effect on their loved one in their ongoing journey. So sometimes people, even in giving away the clothes of their loved one, if you think of it as an act of generosity on their behalf and dedicate for them, and a dedication may be as simple as, may their mind be at peace, may they be happy, I offer these clothes to others on their behalf for the benefit of others. They say that that creates a very positive effect for their loved one. So not only can monks and nuns and lay Buddhists or non-ordained Buddhists pray and do practices for the person who's died, certainly so can the family and loved ones, even if they're not Buddhist. There are also rituals that are done even for babies. If a baby is stillborn, or if they're born, if they're very ill at the time of birth, or if they die immediately after birth. Again, there are rituals and prayers and mantras that can be done for a young child. Whether the person is old, middle-aged, or very young, we use the same prayers and mantras. We recognise that there's a human being there, a consciousness that is going to leave the body, and we do the same prayers and mantras. If at that time, for example, I went to see a couple who had a stillborn baby. The baby was born at 20 weeks and didn't survive, and so they were holding the baby. We had some candles set up. We created a beautiful sacred environment for them, and we did the prayers. They were Buddhist, and we did the prayers and mantras and some chanting for this little baby, for the consciousness to move on in a positive way. So we use the same rituals and prayers, whether it's for a young child, a baby, or an older person. And again, for doctors and nurses, for health practitioners, and for loved ones, again, we need to just have respect for whatever the needs are for either those parents or for the family of that loved one who has died, and to have that very heartfelt communication to find out what's going to be most meaningful for them. Sometimes, for example, in the Tibetan tradition, in Tibet, a body wouldn't be touched after someone has died. They wouldn't be touched probably for about 3 days, and a lama or a Tibetan teacher would be called in to determine whether the consciousness has left the body. And so if someone is a very strongly practicing Buddhist and they don't want the body touched, even for a child, then we would respect that. But for a lot of people also, they need to hold the child or hold the baby that's been born or has died immediately, and we go with that as well. Whatever's most meaningful for those people. We don't want to disturb the minds of the people, or we don't want to disturb the mind of the person who is dying, and we don't want to disturb the mind of the loved ones, because we know when we have an agitated mind, it can affect others, and especially when you're very sick, and especially when you're dying, you become very sensitive to the emotions and the energy of others. So when we walk in the room of someone who's dying, we want to come in a very still and quiet way to respect that process and recognize that they become very sensitive as they're going through the dying process. One of the things that we have to deal with also when someone is very sick, when they're dying or if they've died, is the deep emotion that loved ones feel, that families feel, the deep distress that sometimes families can feel, and the anguish, sometimes guilt, sometimes a whole mixture of different emotions that can arise at that time and afterwards. And I think the most important thing for us, if we're in the role of the carer, if it's a health practitioner, a nurse, a doctor, any other carer, is to have a sense of compassionate presence. From the Buddhist point of view, the two most powerful healing qualities are compassion and loving kindness. Compassion is the wish that others be free of suffering and that wish to be able to do something to free them from suffering. Loving kindness is the wish that others have happiness and to do something to bring about that happiness. So if we have that in mind, if we set a motivation or an intention, may I be a compassionate presence in the lives of these people. May I bring compassion and loving kindness into all of my interactions with them. And we have that intention. When we walk into the room, we bring that in with us. Then whatever words we say, whatever actions we do, are coloured and qualified by that compassion and loving kindness. So we need to practice mindfulness with that, a mindfulness of the needs of others and a mindfulness of our own state of mind, but also mindfulness of compassion and loving kindness, that we bring those qualities to all of our interactions. So then we don't have to have the perfect words for someone in a state of grief. There are no perfect words that are going to match every situation. It's always individual. You know, sometimes it's appropriate to sit in silence with someone. Sometimes it's appropriate to touch them very gently, and sometimes it's appropriate not to touch. The most important thing is our intentional motivation of compassion and kindness, and then to trust your own intuition, to go with yourself. You set that intention, and then trust yourself in the moment. Don't second guess it. Don't start thinking about what do I do? Simply, may I be of benefit to this person, and trust yourself and go with that. And I think people can feel that genuineness. They can feel that sense of kindness and compassion coming through. And then that's where the healing happens. Not that we can have physical healing, but we can certainly be a help in bringing about emotional healing for others who are going through grief. And also bring about healing for ourselves, because we all have to face the fact that all of us are going to die sometime as well. The more we can do that, and this is why it's emphasised in Buddhism, the more we can face our own death with compassion and kindness for ourselves, and with a sense of wisdom about this, the more we can be present for others. If we're carrying around a sense of anxiety and fear and not wanting to go near the idea of talking about death, or our own death, or even the death of our loved ones, we're subtly bringing that into the room when we're with someone who's dying and when we're with grieving families. So if we're able to, and it takes time, it doesn't happen overnight. We need to train ourselves in this, but the more we can recognise and train the mind to recognise, I am going to die at some stage, and I need to face the fear and the anxiety I have about that, and gradually start working through that. And also, if I have grief about having lost a loved one, if I can work through that, I'm going to be able to be more present with others in their grief and in their loss. So sometimes there are also questions about Buddhist funerals or how to deal with the body after death. In a traditional Buddhist funeral, there would be many prayers and practices done. There would be monks and nuns involved, and particular Buddhist prayers done. In a funeral here in Australia where there's a Buddhist influence, there may be a nun or a monk who leads the funeral, who is the celebrant, and some maybe a Buddhist reading or a Buddhist prayer that's done, but it may not be a fully traditional funeral, and that's fine. The family may want some sort of influence of Buddhism, but may not want the full Monty. So again, it's about asking what's most appropriate. And in terms of cremation or burial, probably for the most part Buddhists would go with cremation. In Vietnam, I know that there is a cultural tradition sometimes to bury, but for the most part Buddhists would go with cremation here in Australia, I think. And again, because there are cultural effects in dealing with death and dying, we need to ask the family or the dying person before they die what it is that they want. And in terms of a time frame, I know for some religions, from some other religions, there's a strict adherence to burying someone within 24 hours. That's not the case in Buddhism. There would be much more an emphasis on allowing the body to be undisturbed and waiting at least for 3 days before a cremation happens. And it may be even longer that until the cremation happens. So there's not the same focus and emphasis on an immediate cremation or burial. So in bringing this to a conclusion, I wanted to first say thank you very much for the work that you do. Thank you for what you give to others. Thank you for the care that you provide for others and for the difference that you make in the world. And I hope that whatever I've shared may be of benefit for you and for everybody that you come in contact with. And I wish you every happiness.